The conflict in Vietnam between the French and the Viet Cong put the US, and Truman in particular, in a difficult position. They had to be seen to be taking some sort of action in order to aid the French, but it would have been deemed unpopular by US public opinion if they were to take military action. This means that as a wealthy country, the US ended up aiding the French with extensive economic assistance. The reasons why the US gave assistance include such factors as containing communism and domino theory, the legacy of the Korean War, the positive US economic situation, and the US needing to have an active foreign policy and supporting an ally. This essay will explain why the US offered such an extensive economic assistance to the French in Indochina, the most important reason being their desire to contain communism. So we have established a plan here, relatively briefly, and alluding to a hierarchy. The most important reason why the US offered such extensive economic assistance to the French in Indochina is because of the US's determination to contain communism along with the threat of domino theory. The US were ideologically opposed to the expansion of the Soviet communism, as is made clear with the Truman Doctrine, that specifies the policy of containing communism, meaning that at any cost the US will intervene at any threat of the expansion of communism. This fear is based upon the idea of domino theory, which is the belief that if one country falls to communism, then all those other countries within the sphere of influence will also fall, so on, causing a domino reaction. This would give the US an incentive to provide aid in the form of economic assistance in Indochina, as it was communists that were fighting against the French in Vietnam. So the US had to take some form of action in order to aid containment, as the last thing they would want was for Vietnam to fall to communism, and in turn ignite the domino theory to the surrounding countries. This is the most important reason, because the US's reason for aid to France stems from the key ideology of their country. If it weren't for this anti-communist ideology, then the US wouldn't have felt the need to provide France with their assistance. This key determination of the containment of communism also links to the legacy of the Korean War, which is another important reason as to why the US provided France with assistance. Truman's presidency had been regarded as weak as a result of the events of the Korean War, as he was criticized for not getting involved soon enough, and therefore his popularity was decreasing because he was seen as being soft on communism. As a result of this, Truman was pressured into having to take action in the conflict in Indochina, and this action was in the form of giving financial aid to France. This therefore shows that the reason why the US gave such substantial aid to France is because it was a way that Truman could be shown to be getting involved in containing the threat of communism without actually having to send troops over there, as the French already had the troops there and all they needed was the financial aid. Please be aware, the French had the existing infrastructure. The French had the military presence there already. The United States didn't. Be aware that for all of the US economic and military power they had, the struggle they had to re-establish themselves as a military force in Korea after the North Koreans attacked. So the French had that advantage of already being there. The legacy of the Korean War influenced the decision of whether to send economic aid, which links to another important reason of the US sending aid and not military assistance. There was no choice for the US but to take action, but it was a case of deciding what action they should take. It was a choice between opting for the most extreme of sending troops over to Vietnam or choosing the least extreme action of offering economic assistance. Remember, the Americans had no shortage of cash, but a finite shortage of troops. America couldn't be expected to fight every war and fight every fire, despite the obligations of the Truman Doctrine. The US were very wealthy at the time, and they also had troops ready in the Korean theatre, so they would have more money than soldiers. The offering of economic aid had also been proved to work in the containment of communism in the past in the form of the Marshall Plan in Greece and Turkey in 1947. This therefore explains why the US chose to offer economic assistance to the French, because it seemed the most pragmatic thing to do. They were containing communism, but they didn't have to send military assistance, which would have helped them keep public opinion high. This reason isn't as important as the legacy of the Korean War, because the decision was influenced by what happened in the Korean War, and therefore means the legacy of the Korean War is a more important factor in the US sending economic assistance. If it weren't for the events of the Korean War, the US may have ended up going straight in with the military. All of these factors influenced US needing to have an active foreign policy, which is another reason why the US sent troops, economic assistance to the French. The failings in foreign policy in the past, such as who lost China, but put under the pressure to make the right moves in terms of their foreign policy, already unpopular for use in China, it would have been deemed even more unpopular to send in soldiers, as they were citizens who voted and so were their families. This shows why the US sent economic assistance to the French, because it was influenced and pressurized through all these factors such as containing communism, domino theory, US wealth, and the legacy of Korea, to have an active foreign policy when it came to facing threats such as the threat of conflict in Indochina. The least important reason why the US sent economic aid to the French is because they were allies. They were both democracies and helped in the Second World War. However, the French were imperialists, which the US did not agree with. But when it came to the conflict in Vietnam, the US had to choose the lesser of two evils, between communism and imperialism. Obviously, because of the factors previously stated, the US had to see off the threat of communism and join with the French. Therefore, the US had to send economic aid to the French because there was no other pragmatic way of dealing with the conflict. However, this is the least important reason, because if it weren't for the threat of communism, the US wouldn't have got involved, allies with the French or not. To conclude, the most important reason why the US offered such extensive economic assistance to the French in Indochina is because of the threat of communism and the fear of domino theory. This is the most important reason because it was the factor that influenced all other factors that contributed to the US decision.